Well, welcome back to Consumer Trial Lawyer Academy. I'm very glad to have with me a great friend, Elizabeth Larrick. If you don't know Elizabeth, Elizabeth is one of the national leaders on focus groups. She spends pretty much most of her career now is based on doing focus groups, working with lawyers all over the country. She's considered one of the top experts. I personally used her many times. My firm uses her often. She has a tremendous amount of insight in this area. And I thought it would be useful to people who are following my channel and know me and the type of work that I do to have the benefit of hearing from Elizabeth, and not only for what she can help you with through these sessions. We're going to do 3 or 4 videos on different portions of this world, but also obviously to have had some experience interaction through these videos. Then if you need those types of services, she's also a great resource. So Elizabeth, welcome as always. Always good to see you. Thank you for being with me on the show.
Thank you, Nick, for having me.
When we talked about doing this, you and I both thought it would be a good idea. Just you do your own shows and you have your own company and you have a podcast and YouTube channel and you work in this field pretty much every day, 24/7. This is your world now, right?
Yes. I moved from practicing attorney, having my own, personal injury plaintiff's firm into doing this 100% full time.
And as I mentioned, you've worked with a number of folks that I'm friends with. You work all over the country. You and I have worked together on a number of cases since I moved to Austin, and this is an area of focus for you. You teach with I know Don Keenan's group. Some I've seen you in meetings and stuff there. So you're kind of at the epicenter from the plaintiff's perspective on this type of work nowadays, right?
I would say so. I mean, I feel like plaintiff's work has used focus groups and mock juries for a very long time, but the way that plaintiff's lawyers are using them now is very different and much like there's a lot more flexibility. And so I think that's kind of where, you know, broadening the horizons about using focus groups and mock juries is where we're at right now. And especially with the transition through the pandemic and really, you know, gently forcing lawyers to use more technology to be able to do more as far as even with those focus groups.
Yeah, and that's true. It's that's the thing I can tell the audience. Working with Elizabeth, she's great at both in person, virtual, and she's very flexible about how she can work with you. So it doesn't matter if you're not in Austin, Texas. She works with people from all over the country on these issues, either in person or remote. If you want to travel, or she's always happy to go where you need her if you need to do in person. Another feature of our life in the plaintiff's practice, right, is just frequent flyer miles are back to being a thing, right?
Absolutely. And I mean, what I've seen is, we had this big transition. And even for me, I mean, at the time when the pandemic hit, I mean, I think in January of 2020, I said, okay, like this is it. I'm going to go all in on focus groups and trial prep and witness prep and strategy. And then the pandemic hit and it was like, oh my gosh, how do you do this? How do you do in-person focus groups when you can't get in person? And we had no idea how long it would be before we could do that. And I mean, I'm so grateful that I had a coach at the time who just basically kind of, again, gently forced me into say, get on that Zoom, figure out that virtual focus group. And it's just taken off from there. It's because of the flexibility that we have. And at the time, we still had a lot of uncertainty, even in 2021, with going back in person for trial. So I really wanted people to get comfortable, be flexible. If you had to try a Zoom trial, you could at least try it out with a virtual.
Oh, absolutely. For my own career, I was an early adopter of technology as a solo many, seems like millions of years ago now. I can remember the first video conference deposition I ever took. The witness was in New York. I had to go to there was a company back home in Alabama where I lived that their entire business was video conferencing, and they had built a facility, used to be an old bowling alley. They tore the bowling alley down, put up this nice facility, and you go in there and you had to go into these rooms, and they had these special fiber optic connections. It was so much, then all the little cameras and things you could slide your exhibits under. But it was like it was such a huge investment. There was so much there into that facility for that place to have. I think they had 30 rooms that you could be in person, but then they also were doing the virtual where they were connecting people. And I just remember thinking, man, I am so high tech. This is like 1999, 2000, and that deposition was very clunky and difficult. And it, we would lose connection. We'd have to wait for the connection to come back. So it was really like it was kind of like dial-up internet nowadays, and we think back about that. If you're old enough to remember dial-up, I mean, we probably got some lawyers practicing that don't even remember dial-up. I don't know, but yeah, it's come so far, and it's so much easier now. And as you said, the pandemic, I think, it was critical. I used to suggest video depositions or doing a web service like this a lot of times pre-pandemic, and people would look at you like you lost your damn mind. They're like, what do you mean? Video? What is that? Yeah. You mean the witness will be somewhere else? I mean, I can't lean over the table at them. And I'm like, doesn't really help anyway, but whatever. So yeah, it's come so far, and it is, I think it's something that people should be comfortable with. And I'm like you, I remember very well Zoom, 2020, 2021, we were all forced to get really comfortable with that process. I did an arbitration trial over Zoom that resulted in almost a $2 million verdict in a mortgage servicing case. And literally, I sat in my office, what used to be my kitchen table, I sat there and did that trial over the course of about a week. And it was always, it was always an experience adjusting to that. But the intensity of the work doesn't really go away. It's just you don't get to get up and walk around the courtroom anymore like you used to. So, so let's talk about the first session we want to talk about was, the focus group and mock trials. Specifically talking about targeting trial prep. You worked with me on the Garcia case that I had against Wells Fargo, and that's probably a good, case to talk about for that type of thing. Let's talk us through, from your perspective as the expert, kind of, what you like to do to help plaintiffs' lawyers get ready when they're, sort of on the eve of trial or trial prep, and they really got to get ready and focus. Take us through that process.
Sure. And just, for folks listening in, tuning in, we're talking about in person, because that's what, at the time when Nick and I did these 2 in-persons that again, trial's going to be in person, and you were on the doorstep of trial. So we generally try to say, hey, in person is the best, because at that point in time, thinking about trial prep and when in the case are we talking about? Well, typically people are going to run that mock trial, right? Where it's one of the most involved processes you could ever do, because you got to have a lot of people helping you to play all the different roles. Even if you don't have witnesses come live, you still have a lot of video edits to be able to present witnesses that way. But that's a huge, big endeavor, doing those mock trials. And most people, even, the big companies, the big litigations, they don't do those until the 30-day mark, right? But what we're talking about is plaintiffs' lawyers, folks in, solos or even mid-size, is doing kind of a mock a focus group where basically we're doing kind of an abbreviated trial, meaning, and the way that I like to do them is we have basically opening versus opening. And that can be it, right? So we're talking maybe at the 60-day mark, 60 days before trial, because what you want to be able to do is at that 60-day mark, having that focus group at that point really forces you to write your opening statement. A lot of lawyers will wait to do this. And that's one of the biggest places where it's like, hey, this is the one thing you can nail down now. I know that once you get into trial, bullets are flying and things are changing and you're shucking and jiving, but that opening statement can really be solidified early on. And so that's why I always encourage people at that 60-day mark, even if you want to do the 70-day mark or 75 days, that really then gives you the opportunity to come back and refashion it and do it again. The other reason why I really like the opening versus opening is you can really sit down and say, okay, we'll always have a planning session, like, okay, well, what's the biggest thing that is, terrifying you or the biggest hurdle? And some people say, hey, it's disputed liability, right? Or, hey, it's, it's the pre-existing thing. Or, hey, it's, this, they're not going to care about my clients, right? Like, this is just something that, so we say, okay, let's use them. Let's fashion this opening statement just around that. Such, don't give me an hour long opening statement. That puts everybody to sleep. So we're doing really kind of short ones and they vote in between and then we do discussion. If there's more time, then we can always add in witness clips as well, like really short, 5-7 minutes, just to introduce them to the players of the entire case and get feedback. But that really allows you the dynamic then of being able to come back and do another panel, because we're talking about really, you could get that done in 3 hours, right? And the other thing about being in person is like, you're on your feet, you're in it, you are practicing, you're doing that presentation style, just to get in the mode. Because I know people, when they wait, right, you wait, and it's like, you don't ever hit that mode. And I think you really want to be getting in the trial mode before, the 30-day mark, because then
That's right.
there's this, I mean, Nick, you can probably describe it. There's a total different mode you move into, and it's like, we're doing this versus like, well, maybe
Right.
it's
Right.
continue.
Yeah.
No,
And
no, no.
that's, yeah. And that's something that, one of the lessons we talked about on my channel, I've already done a lesson on it, is that mindset of, when do you start getting ready for that pretrial? And this is a good tie-in if you do think that you want to make that a part of your case. And I'll, from my practical perspective as, the guy that's trying cases, I can tell the audience that what you are able to do for us is help us sort of take off the blinders, look for the weaknesses, see what the level of exploitation is. Elizabeth does a great job of hammering in on the things that you may be scared of about your case, and help you find the things that the other side might exploit, and give you an idea of how people react to it if it's exploited well. And then also that gives you great insight into how do I want to address this and frame this as the plaintiff in the case, so that I'm either disarming this issue well before the defense uh, attempts to make it a problem, or I have great insight into how I need to address it in sort of my case in chief. And so that's where Elizabeth's efforts can be very valuable to you, just to give you just a brutally clear picture of both strengths and weaknesses. So you're not blindsided by something, because for a plaintiff's lawyer who's spent a lot of time getting ready, that's the worst feeling in the world, to be sitting in the middle of the courtroom and you just get punched in the jaw with something that you just, for whatever reason, you didn't see coming. So that third party perspective and getting ready for trial prep with using someone with Elizabeth's skill set is really great for the cases that you're expecting to go to trial, for sure. And I do think you're right that, I'm a little more aggressive, especially on my consumer trials, because you often just know there's just never going to pay enough money voluntarily. I get that a lot on those cases, not so much on PI, but on the consumer side. So, I think we did the Garcia trial prep with you. It might have even been 120 days out just because we were so certain that it was going. So, but yeah, that timing is important. And, you really have to think that through so that you make sure you have enough time after you've had this good school session with Elizabeth, to get the most out of that process. So
Yeah.
it's great to get you focused on where your eyes need to be on the good and the bad in your case.
I don't think you really, especially if you're running an opening, you really kind of learn the sequencing of like where to put things. We generally always have an opening template that we're using. And that's great. We should do that. But sometimes it's like, oh, we need to educate before we get there. And I think that that is so important. And we learned one of those, the takeaways from the Garcia case prep
Yeah.
where we did back to back, right? So we in it to win it. Did a morning session and an afternoon session, which is great if you don't have a ton of time, or rather, and I think in your position, and you can probably explain this, Nick, like you really wanted to get the information and be able to marinate versus spreading it out.
Right. Yeah. So, when we did Garcia, you're right, we did two sessions. And, one session in particular, the morning session, we really were trying to attack perceived weaknesses, things that we felt were troublesome, and see how that diminished the response, because we had really outlandish facts of how our clients were treated. And we knew, based on the positive, sort of sky's the limit scenario, but we wanted to think about what was going to cause us the most trouble, right? And then we wanted to test sort of that A/B group, come back with a second group and sort of test strategies on diffusing the trouble spots. And it was a very successful, perspective. And as we were able to resolve that case successfully on about the third day of trial. But it was guys, when I tell you Elizabeth's great at this, we have really good lawyers. Wells Fargo can afford the best lawyers in the world, but I think Elizabeth actually did a better job arguing their position than they did with an unlimited budget to spend as much time as they wanted. She really was very good at poking into the weak spots and trying to turn the temperature down where it otherwise would have been an inferno in our favor. And I think the way the focus groups reacted prepared me for what I saw when some of the negatives started to pop up, in the trial itself. We were able to precondition some things and try to deal with them ahead of time. We sort of used the things that Elizabeth helped us focus in on to disarm those defenses as much as we could. And then, of course, we were able to anticipate, based on reactions observed during the trial and what we had seen with the focus groups. I was able to talk more confidently with the clients about, how this might impact outcomes as, we get the 2 or 3 days and some of that negative percolates a little bit. We were able to talk about with them, pros and cons more clearly about why it might make sense to resolve the case while those questions are in the air. And it ended up being a very successful outcome. The clients were super satisfied, but we had a lot more clarity walking into, the lion's den, so to speak, than if we had gone and done, the thing without having had spent the time that we did with Elizabeth and her group. So,
Yeah, one of my favorite things is writing the defense side, the opposing counsel side, because people, I mean, I get it. You get so far deep into a case, it's really hard to craft the other side. And the benefit that I have is I've been through 1,000 focus groups, in person, virtual, mock, you name it, to over 1,000. I can tell you pretty soundly what some of those what some of
right.
those rat jurors are going to say. So it's pretty easy for me to come in and create a pretty solid defense opening statement, and then questions. And I think one of the things too that was, I get a lot of questions about this, and I think that Nick, you did a great job preparing, which was you wanted to ask for a really large number, but you really wanted to test the calculation, like how you wanted to calculate that. And I think
Right.
so many people not that they wing it, but there's just a lot going around asking for that large number. And so I thought, your idea of coming in and us, opening statement and having discussion, and then but leaving some time for you to be able to kind of talk them through and walk them through, and then just ask questions about the calculation. And I think that that's a great way of really helping give like some certainty to your number, like how to do it, and like getting some feedback and getting them kind of involved in helping you.
Yeah, that was for people who don't really know where we were with that case. What we were anticipating was if that case went to a verdict, it had the potential on the punitive side to have a B at the end of it because Wells Fargo is so big and it was so outrageous. So what we wanted to do was try to figure out how to get the maximum possible compensatory award. So we had several thoughts about how to talk that up and how to explain it in a way that was defensible, given the enormity of the impact on our folks' lives. I mean, it essentially had been devastating to them for more than almost 15 years at the point of trial. Really had just lost, their 40s and into their early 50s with this problem. And, those are critical years for a family, right? A couple trying to move through normal financial principles where they've got, kids getting to adulthood and college, and they're thinking about, hey, I'd like to retire one day. They just lost all that. Their life was just blitzed by this whole scenario. And so we were trying to figure out how to get the compensatory numbers up. And, by doing the work with Elizabeth, we were able to try to explain a theory that we thought had a lot of potential merit, and then of course see how the jury reacted to it. And it was interesting because we spent a lot of time ruminating over it, and we thought we had really good ideas, but it was not. It didn't. The testing turned out that it was a little bit confusing. And so it kind of sent us back to the drawing board, where otherwise we would have been thinking, oh, we're so smart. But by being able to test that, that was a very important piece. And, and even though we're talking about, trial prep here, it's another thing I'll say, and it'll come up in some of the other sessions is, it's also never too early. If you have a case and you're sort of starting at the beginning and you think, this case could go to trial because either the defendant won't pay all that I want them to pay, or they're going to be particularly resistant or whatever, and you have a question like that, how about a damages calculation? You can get Elizabeth involved much earlier than the pretrial phase to say, hey, we want to test this and think about how to develop this during the trial. And that's another way to use Elizabeth's resources that I think is very effective. I think sometimes lawyers, like you said, they tend to wing it, and I think lawyers sometimes don't tend to think from the end back to the beginning. And if you really want to be a trial lawyer, you need to think where your endpoint is, and then you got to sort of plot your steps sort of in reverse order to get to your endpoint, right? You don't start at the beginning and say, hey, I want this to end this way. You have to think about, if this is the ending I'm looking for, what have I got to do to get there? And so identifying a bottleneck, like how do I calculate damages in front of a jury that makes sense, and then testing those theories is a great use of your abilities and your talents. And I know that you work with a lot of lawyers on just things like that, just a question about a piece of their case, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's kind of where thinking through, all the ways to use a focus group and the flexibility, absolutely. And that's kind of where thinking about even, what I think is also helpful, even in the sense of trial prep, but if that, those mediation, like, because generally if you've got a large case, you're going through more than one mediation, maybe that last mediation that you thought was going to get it done, you do a focus group. And again, with the flexibility, we're not talking about an all-day endeavor. We're really talking about 2 hours, 4 hours, depending on the depth of information you want to get in with them.
Right.
And the other thing about like the focus group, and that's very different from a mock jury, which is we talk with them. We have that discussion, that moderation of like, just like the example we gave, which was you walked through the calculation and then we went slide by slide, like what was confusing? How would you do it? Like it's very much an open discussion versus a closed room deliberation, because what you really want to get out of the focus group is what they think, but then really why that they think that. And that's kind of where I really enjoy the focus group setup, because that allows us to really ask those questions. Okay, well, really, what is confusing and how would it be better? And sometimes they can give us some golden nuggets and sometimes they can't. And that's okay, because even knowing that it's just too far confusing, like lets you, like Nick said, step it back. But
Right.
taking
Right.
that focus group, even after that last mediation fails, and again, you could still be 6 months from trial at this point, or 4 months, they're going to give you so much information about, maybe you learn at that point, like, hey, you really do need to settle this thing, because people either they just don't care, or maybe it's just way too confusing, or maybe the defense is just really so strong in the attitudes already with jurors that you don't really want to risk it. So, even thinking about dialing back, not just having that right for prep, trial prep, but having it after that last mediation has failed, is really helpful to know, okay, do we really roll the dice and settle it? But I will tell you, at that point, like, you've already spent a lot of money. So
Yeah.
you may want to roll the dice.
Yeah.
But I'm working with a crew right now who has we've done some virtual focus groups leading up to trial, and it's just not turning over the way that they thought. And I'm just like, hey, but these folks are, they're telling you the truth, and you can roll the dice and go. But, then it becomes really a decision of, okay, what do we do? And what did the focus groups tell us? So help making those last minute decisions, even if it is, okay, we just do need to settle this because we can roll the dice and get zero, and then like zero case expenses are reimbursed,
Yeah.
zero attorney's fees,
Yeah.
which,
Two, 2/3 of zero is still zero, right?
that's right. Like, hey, listen, I get it. I ran my own office and I was very cost conscious, and, you know, I think the percentage now is like 2% of cases go to trial. So 98% are settlements that fuel our law firms, that pay our bills. Like, so if there's nothing wrong with that, and having somebody else, that third party optics, to say like, yeah, there's nothing exciting about this, or that defense that they have is just ingrained in the attitudes of people, and it's going to be too hard to, you don't have any great facts to overcome
Yeah.
that. So it's
Too
definitely,
hard to flip the mindset, and that's great information. And it's part of what the calculus we're always considering. Just everything that goes into this, what I call a gumbo of what do you do in your decision making, and a huge part of it is your venue, because of the general attitude of sort of the consensus of the people in that particular county or that federal district, wherever. And we always talk about pro plaintiff and pro defendant places, but there are places where there's just a mindset that is more against the idea of litigation, no matter what happened to you. And that's always very acute in certain types of litigation. Med mal is my obvious go-to, is the worst kind to try to win, because I never really dealt with it because it was too, if I ever thought I had a med mal case, I would always refer it, because they're always too expensive, too risky, too costly for, a solo practitioner. And even now in our firm, we still refer out med mal for the most part, just for those same reasons, because, well, in Texas, it pretty much doesn't exist anymore. It's the other. But in Alabama for a long time, I mean, we had one law firm that defended every doctor. Every doctor was covered by the insurance company. They owned half the insurance company, so they were literally fighting over their own money. I mean, and so they were brutal. And then of course every favor that could be given to a doctor was always given. So, but one thing, that another point I think that you should be hit, that I think you can help with too, is when you have questions about how do witnesses hit. Uh, for instance, I can think of a case where you've got dueling liability experts, right? like in a product setting or a med mal setting even, you can put on a small short focus group to get reactions to just the competing narrative of those two physicians and get perspectives on how do these two people hit, who's more credible, who's more likable, who's more believable. And, for a plaintiff's lawyer, that's really, really, really good information if you've got a case that really is just battle of the experts type thing, right?
Absolutely. I mean, and sometimes it's actually when one side has an expert and the other doesn't, then you really want to know how much extra oomph is that expert giving them. And it can be, for example, it could be the defense has an expert and plaintiff doesn't, or vice versa. And so we had that recently in a case where getting ready for trial, had some opening statements, and one side has an expert on seatbelts and the other doesn't. And it was like, okay, so how much, and it was amazing how the focus group was like, well, wait a second, like, and they totally like gave so many like pieces and pinpoints to go back and fight that expert, that I was like, well, how does this work? Well, he didn't do this and he didn't, and I was like, oh, okay, wow. So they really gave a lot of feedback on, at first it sounded good, but they really picked him apart. And so it was great for for our lawyers watching to be able to be like, awesome. Like, I know what kind of cross exam I'm going to go after now versus what maybe I was going to do before, because I want to give those jurors exactly what's on their mind, and
Yeah,
let
yeah,
him walk into it and then me be able to cross examine him and pick him apart.
yeah. It's another part of the tunnel vision of trial prep is you have your own sort of preconceptions as the lawyer about what you think is important. Yeah, both chuckle when we say the lawyer thinks something's important, because oftentimes we're such lawyers, right, that we don't actually know what the hell really matters in a case. So it's that independent perspective of non-lawyers, which is going to be your jurors, that a lot of times can get you on the right track. And that's a great example. That's a great analysis, because I have heard similar stories, and sometimes it's after I got my ass handed to me by somebody because I didn't realize, what really was important. But that's really another great way to use the resource to help you find what is troubling or what is the real issue versus what you as the lawyer thinks would be the issue. So
Yeah.
don't
And
ever think you're too smart to get help.
yeah, well, and it's, we're trained a certain way. Like we are totally trained to dive into those details and there are things that still work on cross, but it's always evolving. And the other thing too is like your audience is evolving, the jurors are evolving. And that's kind of why sometimes we can't rely on the old adages because it doesn't fit with the new audience. So that's why I think when you're getting ready for trial and you have, okay, this is how I want to try this case, this is my theme, and you take it to a focus group and they tell you something a little different, it's like, okay, well, refashion it and come back and test it again. And you're going to hear, like, okay, this is good, or no, we're still kind of missing the mark. And that's kind of where, like, when you have the focus group setting, you're literally going to be able to hear and follow up on what more you want to know. And that's kind of why, like, lawyers always ask me, like, well, what do you get, like, when you do a focus group? And I'm like, okay, well, first of all, like, just listening to people pick apart your case is like mind blowing. And what they ignore is also just as important as what they talk about. And so that's why it's like, okay, once we finish the focus group, it's like, okay, we have to literally kind of sit down and say, okay, what did we hear? What did we not hear? Like, and a lot of times we'll hear, like, I'll have lawyers who will hear one particular voice and I'll say, okay, I know we heard that, but that was only Judy. Okay. Not everybody in the group said that. And so and that's kind of where, having done so many focus groups, I can help people interpret and say, okay, what Judy said is important. It's one point of view, but the whole group didn't follow Judy. So, let's all keep that in mind and just keep going through what were the things that we heard What did we not hear? How are they discussing it, right? Even we can get great analogies from people. We can get a great way of how they approach it or how they even talk about it. Then just take that language and put it into your opening statement, and you're just speaking to them, right? It's like, oh, you're speaking their language. It's gonna be so much simpler for them to understand versus lawyer language, which can, stump people. And it's just like, oh boy, you really don't want someone to be stumped at the beginning of your opening and then they don't hear the rest of what you're saying.
Yeah, you're right. And that's always, I mean, they're just, you know, obviously every case has, you have to balance your sort of cost benefits analysis of how much you can put into these resources, but this is never wasted money. I mean, if you have, any inkling that you're going to trial, you should definitely at least do a short focus group and at least test your main points and your main ideas and what you think are your key issues, because the feedback you get is going to help you no matter what it is. And it's just so invaluable to get that perspective from people who are not married to the case and enamored with the case and invested in the case for the years that you have put into it, usually by the time it's ready for trial. And that's always, uh, it's always great perspective because it helps you step back, take that breath and go, okay, I believed X, Y, and Z before I walked into this, and either got that confirmed or I got this new information that will still help me, even if it's negative at that moment, because it's a lot easier to work with negative in that moment before trial than to get that negative feedback from the jury panel after a bad outcome.
Yeah.
That is not the time to be educated about the problems with your case. So think of it as a sort of a free pass to find the warts if you are one of those people that it's hard for you to see the good and the bad. Or, another great thing is that just if you have limited trial experience, right? I mean, there's so many lawyers today who, I mean, I see guys are 10, 12 years in, and they still have not been in front of the jury. And, that's, wow. That's happening. We've become a very paper oriented profession, and we, a lot of people are losing the entire art of trial because they don't do it. So, when you haven't tried a lot of cases, it might be the best money you spend, you know, because it's going to help you. Because the other thing is, the jury don't mind. A focus group doesn't mind kind of punching a hole in your bag. Also, if you think you're doing a really good job, like, I don't really understand that guy. He's kind of quirky. I don't like him. Whatever. It still gives you good information because, again, these are normal people. They're not the folks in your office on your payroll. They'll give you the unvarnished truth. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that's good information.
And you bring up a really good point of calming the nerves, gaining confidence, getting up and standing on your feet, being in a suit, delivering it to a panel. Like that really significantly helps you get over that hurdle sometimes if you haven't had as much experience. And I can tell you when I was doing my own, running my own firm, and we were doing in person because that's all we did was in person. My ability to communicate with people and my confidence just standing up in front of a bunch of strangers significantly improved. Like people think, oh, you're just a natural, like, no, speaking skills, communication, standing and delivering, like those are all skills that have to be practiced over and over. And having, you know, you're going to, it's just that, even that practice alone is so helpful in those focus groups that you can't get really any other place. Yes, you can stand in your kitchen and have your wife listen to it. Of course, you can sit and you can grab a group of your family, get together and do that as well. But it's those strangers who are like, I didn't get it. Like, like
Yeah.
that don't make no sense. Like that's, and you're like, oh, okay. Because again, there's always going to be just a little bit of bias. People tell me, well, hey, I got a group of my friends, or I got a group, and I'm like, well, those are people just like you, because you're friends with them. Like they're not going to totally, kick you, kick that case to the curb. And sometimes that's what you need to hear in order to get yourself into that different mindset and say, okay, I got to keep working at this, or I got to go at this a different way. And the focus groups give you direction. So it's not just like they're kicking you while you're down and now you're stuck.
Right. Oh,
They'll help you get out of the
like I
hole.
said, they're not kicking you while you're moping out of the courtroom trying to figure out what happened, right? Yeah.
Right.
I mean, yeah, I remember a friend of mine telling me that, he always learned more from the cases he lost than the cases he won. And as we're talking this, I remember him talking about, we would talk to the jury afterwards, and, when we lost, and they'd have all these reasons why we lost, and they would tell us all these things, and you'd be learning, what's coming at you. And, you know, I mean, using focus groups in theory, if you have a terminal problem and you didn't realize it, well, that helps give you information that you can go settle the case. You can go to the client and go, we're going to get killed if we go forward with this because this is the problem that these, our focus groups say. But by the same token, if you just have presentation issues, or you're on the wrong fact, or you don't see the right point, or you're not clear in your theory, those are things you can learn from that focus group. And whatever it costs, it's cheap compared to losing, that's for sure.
Yeah, it is. And people scoff and they're like, oh, it's just that's one of the, oh, it's too expensive. I'm like, okay, well, let's talk about first of all what you have to do at trial, which is a lot of things. But one of the things you're supposed to do as a lawyer is assess the risk. And if you don't go and find out the information, you can't accurately assess the risk of going, because the only person assessing risk in your case is the defense, and they're always going to tell you, right? They're going to try and beat you down, right? You go to mediator, they're going to try and beat you down. That's not necessarily, the assessment that you need. But I have a group of folks who they co-counsel and try cases together. And he just has this one lawyer who gets really fixated. And so they come on down. We come down to, they're getting ready for trial because they want that particular lawyer to go through the experience of delivering this opening statement that he wants, and then just basically hearing like, we don't get what you're saying. Because we all, we all try to tell them it's confusing. And you're really losing them because you're using all this medical terminology, and they gracefully tell him, like, I don't get it. Like, we always, when we do opening statements, we always gauge what is the confusion level, like on a scale of 1 to 10, how difficult was it to follow? And they'll tell you, man, like, I've lost or whatever it was.
Yeah.
And I think it, specifically for this pair that they come and they do my in-person getting ready for trial, they basically like, it helps him because he says, okay, then what do we need to do? And they basically get on the horse and, go get that visual aid to help, or whatever it may be. Cause that's particularly what they did in that case, was they needed a really solid timeline for this particular medical malpractice case. And his timeline was so confusing. So then they were able to go convince him, like, we need a professional. And so they went and got a professional to make a really solid exhibit for them.
Yeah. And I mean, and like I say, I mean, man, a medical malpractice case, I mean, you can't get in a courtroom for less than $100,000. That ain't the case. You skimp on a timeline, I mean,
Yeah, well, yeah, I know.
not spend $1,000 on a professional timeline after I spent 100,000 on a doctor to show up and testify. I'm like, holy shit. No, you definitely, yeah, I'm glad they were able to work that out, because that
Yeah.
seems like the wrong place to pinch a penny. If you got to go, that's med mal's kind of like some of the cases I deal with, but worse. I mean, it's my complex stuff on steroids, because you have lawyers who specialize in nothing but defending these cases, and then you have all the special rules that favor doctors. But yeah, that's another tremendous use. And in consumer law in particular, I always think about, again, things you can test is there are a lot of consumer law statutes around the country where there are statutory damages, for instance. And you might be in a case where you think there's $1 million there in compensatory damages, but the statutory damages are $5,000 or $10,000, right? And so another place you can test very easily is, well, what is the impact of saying, I want $1 million for this case, but under this one count over here, it gives you $1,000 for this violation of law. How does that impact the jury's thinking about your ask over here for $1 million, right? And in the past, one of the things I've done in my own cases is I don't ask for the statutory part, because my nightmare is I'm standing up talking about $1 million and the jury's going, but wait a minute, that statute said $1,000, and it becomes like a low anchor point. And if you're not certain about your ways to handle that, right, then that's another sort of great thing you can test with the focus group. Does that statute that says you get $1,000 for statutory plus whatever actually harm you suffered, does that $1,000 drive the valuation of the whole case down? Or is it sort of ignored? It's just kind of like a tag along. Those are things that this system, in using you and using focus groups, allows you to test and get answers to, right, before you ever have to actually stand in front of a jury and just wonder how it's going to turn out. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, lots of great uses for trial, that's for sure.
Yeah, and so for the folks that my intended audience, especially consumer lawyers and especially younger folks that haven't tried a lot of cases, I think that takeaway from this conversation, I hope for you, is that nothing bad can happen by using focus groups or having mock trials. And if you really think you've got to go to trial and you believe your case is headed that way, then I think you definitely want to be ahead of the curve and get out there far enough out in advance that you have time to adapt. You don't want to be doing this, the Friday afternoon before the Monday trial starts, because you might, at that point, what you learn, while you might be able to make some changes, you might not be able to make enough, or you may learn that you've just spent all this time getting ready for trial when you probably should have settled the case, 120 days earlier, right? So getting a hold of Elizabeth, or if you don't use Elizabeth, finding someone like her, which would be incredibly hard to do because she's very good at what she does. But if you can find someone to do that, get them involved early enough in your case that you can, make meaningful use of her talents and skills to help you make your case stronger. And then, don't be afraid to use her just about, the questions that come up that you think are really sort of the fork in the road in your case, so to speak. If you think it's sort of key issues, testing those things earlier will help you develop your proof better, is sort of my opinion on that. We, in a non-consumer case, we recently hired Elizabeth to help us, where we're trying to focus liability on the product supplier in a product's case, rather than the obvious target of a lot of the liability, which is the workers' comp barred co-employee in a product setting. So that's a good example of a way to make use of what Elizabeth is able to do with her skills much earlier than trial prep. So don't be afraid to call her at the outset of a case and say, hey, I have these issues and I want to test them. She can give you great advice and help on anything of that nature, and it's a good use of that resource. Elizabeth, anything else you want to cover on this video before we cut away for another session?
I don't think so. I just a lot of folks run their own focus groups, and I think that is great. I think if you're getting ready for trial, though, you need to bring in somebody who's a professional, at least a professional moderator, because you just get so biased that you can't ask a very neutral question and take the feedback, so that would be the one other tip I would say. Hey, if you're going to trial, go ahead and get that neutral moderator in there, get somebody in there to help you discuss and get the feedback you need to hear.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point because if you're getting ready for trial and you aren't fired up enough that it's hard for you to be dispassionate, then you probably aren't in the right business.
I'll say Nick's a very good example of a passionate guy.
Yeah, I have a hard time. I have to have Elizabeth's help because I'm like, I want to fight.
It's true.
Well, Elizabeth, thank you again for this session and talking with us, and thank you for being willing to share more of your knowledge in these upcoming sessions. And we're going to cut this one off here with several more to come. But thanks everyone for watching.
Thank you.